All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the AIS Exchange. And today's topic is Advancing Research Transparency, a view from MISQ. Now, this is based on uh, an editorial that Andrew Burton Jones, the editor-in-chief of MIS Quarterly, along with his colleagues, wrote in the MIS Quarterly issue of volume 45, number 2, in June of this year. So you can read that if you haven't. We will have a brief introduction going forward in a few minutes. So we'll start with a couple of housekeeping things, and one of which is that I encourage you to ask questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A section of your screen. That way we can make sure that those questions get consolidated and answered. And I will begin with introducing the panelists, followed by Andrew Burton Jones, giving you an overview just in case you haven't had a chance to read the editorial. We will then have 10 minutes or so of Q&A questions from me for the panelists. And I'll go to each of the panelists. They'll answer those questions in about 2 minutes each. And then we'll leave for the next 30, 35 minutes, depending on the time, Q&A from you. And again, please type your questions in the Q&A section. And then we'll have an opportunity to move over to the networking tables. And Brooke will help us do that, where you can meet with our panelists, as well as other colleagues who have joined in today. So let me begin with introducing the panelists. I'll start with myself. My name is Rajiv Kohli. I'm the Vice President of Publications for AIS. I'm also a professor at the Raymond A. Mason School of Business at William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Today I'm serving as the moderator, which means I'm the bad guy who will keep time. And so when need be, I might have to curtail the discussion. But the idea is for us to have enough time for you to ask questions and also to network after that. I'm joined on the floor with my panel, Weifang Bo. She's a professor of information systems at Nanyang Technological University, or NTU, in Singapore. She's currently the deputy dean of the Nanyang Business School. Andrew Burton Jones is a professor of business information systems at UQ Business School, and that's at the University of Queensland in Australia. He serves as the editor-in-chief of MIS Quarterly. Xavier Oborn is a professor of healthcare management in innovation and organizational change at the Warwick Business School in UK. And Balaji Padmanabhan is a senior editor of MIS Quarterly, and he's a professor of information systems at University of South Florida's Muma College of Business, where he's also the director of the Center for Analytics and Creativity. So welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here. This is a very important topic for us, for our community, and I'm glad that you've taken the time to come and speak with us. For the audience, this is a topic that many of us are practicing, just don't know about it. And the objective is to have it formalized now in our journals. And with that, I'll ask Andrew Burton Jones to give us an overview of what's in the editorial and where are we heading with research transparency in MISQ. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rajiv, and thanks everyone for this opportunity. It's really wonderful to be able to spend the time with you. I'll just share my screen. All right. And so thanks again. I'll just go through slides. It's not very long, and it's just a précis of the editorial that was, the link is there, and the editorial is freely available online. I'll just start with a brief definition of what we mean by research transparency. And so we define it as being open about what you did in a study and its implications. And we include both of those, the what you did and its implications, because both are interesting and important and are caught up in what it means to be transparent and what it could mean to be transparent. Going along with that, we have to say that we can't talk meaningfully about transparency without acknowledging research plurality. We have many different approaches to research in our field. from different empirical methods to different design science research methods and qualitative and quantitative. We need to support and celebrate all the many ways of research that is conducted in our field. Now, in the March editorial of this year, we talked about our stakeholder vision at MISQ, and we really want to be serving authors, serving our external stakeholders, and serving science. It's really important to us. And even though, we've written these, and it's written up in the March editorial around, trying to be the most author-focused IS journal, the most impactful, I'm sure myself and all of our editors, whichever IS journal we were part of, MISQ or any of the others, we would say the same things. We want to help authors the most, to help our external stakeholders the most through our research, and to help lead our field in responsible research. And we really see the Transparency Initiative as supporting all of these. So in serving authors, to help our authors focus on the main contributions of their articles, while also enabling them to provide additional details that would enhance the impact of their work. Clarifying and reducing the scope of the review process to stop having sort of review packet bloat where authors are inundated with 120 pages of a review packet and so on. Serving our external stakeholders, accelerating research and innovation on important topics by providing all of the information needed to accelerate that work, and promoting credibility in publications and greater understanding of what research actually involves and the limits of research. And then serving science to concentrate our review process on what matters most, to really refine the review process and improve the credibility of our work, while reaffirming the plurality of methods and approaches in our field, and generativity, which can be enhanced by making our work more transparent. So we see this transparency initiative as a one-to-one match with the goals to improve our work for all of our stakeholders. And we're not alone in this kind of effort. Many journals across many fields are doing this sort of stuff. The first link there is to management science, for instance, but there's other journals here that are either within, on the borders of our field, or outside our fields that we're familiar with. And many of you may be, in fact, even very well read on the different policies there are in different fields. In the editorial, we went through a number of different dimensions of this topic. So we talked about, why now, the purpose, who benefits from transparency, what kind of content we might provide, how we might provide that, which mechanisms, which venues, and so on. When to be transparent. For instance, we talked about acknowledging what you're going to be doing up front, but then you're not having to provide that information until a paper has received a minor revision. We also talked extensively about why not, the dangers involved in having too much transparency or pushing too hard on transparency. What if you take a sort of a culture of policing and all of this sort of thing? So we talked extensively about that, and to try to have a wise approach to doing this at the quarterly. The policies basically have normative elements, so our expectations, structural elements, so roles and resources, and procedural elements. So we talk in the editorial about what we're going to do at particular points in time. And in the basics, we're going to start in January. We're keen to learn from authors, and we're going to be balancing a clarity of guidelines with some flexibility of application and guidance from the SE. And we provide lots of questions and answers from authors on a link already at MISQ, and what we're going to do is update that based on the kind of questions we get today. And so we look forward to your questions very much. So with that, I'll finish the slides, and once again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Andrew. So I will now begin asking the questions, and I'll mention the names of the panelists that I'm going to go to. So the first question will go to Avior and Balaji. Avior, I know you're having a little bit of a difficulty with Wi-Fi, so Balaji, if you want to get started, and then Avior, if you can, join in. So my first question is, the editorial discusses the purpose of seeking transparency, which Andrew also summarized just now. So the two related questions I have for you are, what prompted this editorial? Was there a problem that we were trying to address? Balaji?
So thank you, Rajiv. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And so, in the editorial, as Andrew briefly summarized, there were at least six purposes, for getting into this. And I think I'll highlight a few, which is that people tend to think that it's either replication and so on. But if you step back and see what's happened to the IS field, a lot of what people have been doing is now getting used very significantly. And because of access, because of platforms like SSR and Archive and so on, research is being instantly made available, and policymakers, industry, others are building on this, and so are fellow researchers, right? So we are at a very unique time when stuff that we do is instantly consumed. And there are some examples. For instance, in Science, there was an editorial that came out too, where they said, people are coming up with, let's say in my area, algorithms for, in healthcare that can cure diseases and so on. Don't we want to know how that research was done if we have to start using it on patients? And these types of, when research we're doing has this kind of impact, then things like openness and transparency are going to help our field and the researchers in a very significant manner. So there are multiple other purposes too, being generative for authors, increasing the trust and so on. So I think I'll encourage the group to take a look at the editorial to see some of those. But I will want to turn to you as well in case.
Yes, I mean, I think, Balaji, what you said makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to speak from largely the perspective of the interpretive field. And generally, the replication debate has not been as hot a topic in the interpretive field. And I guess, though, Rajiv, you were asking if there's a problem, I think one of the reasons why we were keen to include a greater move towards what might be called transparency for qualitative is that we want to be at the forefront of how this might be shaped, because there is much less precedence for how we shape transparency in qualitative domain. And so I think the problem is to be proactive here, and we want to shape what transparency means, and largely what we have felt as a qualitative community, and myself as having connected with many thinkers within the qualitative space, is that we want this to be about promoting the trustworthiness of interpretive and qualitative research. And often this paradigm is less understood. It's a minority within a largely positivistic paradigm out there in science. And so we can use this vehicle for greater transparency to help more convincing arguments that the work that we do has a lot of merit. And so in this vein, it's less about access to data so that there can be replication, because of course, in an interpretive approach, all can be data. And so it's really less about accessing transcripts and diaries and more about promoting a trustworthy account of how the research was conducted and how the reasoning arguments have been built up. And I guess this is largely still an open book as to how this might happen. And so we really do want to enroll the community in the process of shaping what this might look like, because it will have an impact, I expect, for qualitative research in our neighboring fields. And there is a strong agenda here in the quarterly to prevent this from being hijacked into a replication agenda disguised into the qualitative paradigm, and really to build up a plurality of ways to be more transparent or trustworthy in what the research findings actually mean.
Thank you, Avior. Thank you very much. My next question will be for Weifong and Avior, if you can join in. So from the audience perspective who are joining us today, what they would like to know is, what does MISQ expect the authors to know as they are getting ready to submit a paper or perhaps start a new research project? Is there a special kind of documentation that they should preserve and turn it into you? So Weifong?
Yep. I think this is really a question that all authors are concerned about. I'm sure we've all tried to submit papers to journals where they've asked for transparency materials, and they often ask for it right up front, and we end up sort of not being very sure sort of how it will be used eventually. So the nice thing about what we hope to do at MIS Quarterly is to make sure that these transparency materials that are required will actually only be submitted at the minor revision stage. But right up front, we require authors to declare what kind of transparency materials they plan to provide. So this requires authors to think a little bit carefully about the transparency materials that they would need to be prepared. So if you're asking about what authors would need to do differently, I would advise that authors should start to think a little bit more systematically about how to make sure that they document their work carefully, especially the ones that end up in the manuscript that we end up accepted in the journal. And I think one of the key things that we are hoping to do with this more flexible approach, where it involves a dialogue between the authors as well as the senior editors, is to make sure that we sort of push the limits of transparency. I think many authors think that, oh, I'm under a NDA, for example, and therefore I cannot disclose anything. But I think our approach here is to have this dialogue with the senior editors to think about ways that can increase the transparency of the materials. So for example, if actual data cannot be provided, can we provide simulated code? If actual code cannot be provided, can we provide pseudocode? So I think with this dialogue and more flexible approach, we actually make sure that the authors start thinking early, and we try to push the envelope of transparency. Ivan?
Thank you, Wai-Fong. Xavier, would you like to add something?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rajiv. So again, I'm going to answer that question from an interpretive, qualitative perspective. And initially, there isn't any difference in what I think one needs to do in starting a research project other than what is already considered best practice in the field. And so best practice does want us to be systematic and keep track of our process. And I do want to emphasize Wai-Fong's point about, the papers are unique as to how they can emphasize their findings as being trustworthy or as being transparent to the readers. And so there is really a genuine dialogue around papers as to what can be done. But being systematic in the fieldwork, particularly about access, I mean, who is doing the data collection, who is actually doing what kind of interpretation, the positionality of stakeholders within the field. So what was the role of the research team within the field? What were they expecting? How did they engage with field participants? In a normal 45 to 50 page manuscript, there isn't space to disclose all that kind of information. So really, this is an opportunity to give more information. Of course, the journal paper must be standalone. So this does not mean that we are seeking to omit important details from the paper, but keeping track of how the process actually unfolds, rather than finding that we need to present a clean, neat, specific story at the end as a template is really what we're looking for. What were the steps that were followed? And often these steps, particularly if it's a longitudinal study, become more vague over time. So keeping track of the process, I would say, would be a key thing to do. But this is already excellent practice in the field, so it's really nothing new.
Thank you, Xavier and Wai-Fong. That was very helpful with examples that authors can think about as they are conducting research. Now let's move on to the other side. So authors would like to know, perhaps, Andrew, a question for you. In planning for transparency, could you explain the process by which the author supplied material that we just talked about will be used by MIS Quarterly?
Yeah, sure. So basically we've been working on this all year, and we've moved now from writing the editorial and communicating about it, including this workshop, to operationalizing it, and that will involve instructions for authors on the websites, information in the Scholar One submission system. There will also be implementation steps that will be followed. So I wouldn't want authors thinking, oh, they're just starting this with no structure. We've set up senior editor meetings to ensure that we have consistency amongst all the senior editors, so that things don't just depend on which senior editor you get. The policy committee has also agreed to have systematic reviews of the implementation of this, to make sure, as well as an independent oversight to ensure that it's going well. So I want authors to feel that it will be, over the next few months, we are going to be having the instructions clear, very clear for authors, the system working for authors to be able to do this. In the background, we will be working as a senior editor board and then the policy committee to make sure things are consistent, to make sure things don't just depend on the person who happens to be handling your paper, and so on. So yeah, we've been spending pretty much the whole year working on this, and we're now very much into the operational nitty-gritty to get it working, and that's the priority over the next 6 months.
Thank
What
you.
I would say for any author who wants to do anything early, you can always communicate with your editor, even now.
Sorry to interrupt you, Andrew. Thank you for that overview behind the scenes of what authors can expect. My next question was going to be for Balaji, but he is going in and out, apparently having difficulty with his connection. There he is. Yeah. So there is a lot of information that you shared today that's also in the editorial in MIS Quarterly. And it discusses the possibilities of what, when, who, and how transparency will be institutionalized. Tell us a little bit about what do you expect, Balaji, to accomplish from today's AIS Research Exchange?
Thank you, Rajiv, because the audience may have seen, if not, I encourage them to, is the FAQ associated with the editorial that's available at the MISQ site. And so we do understand that not everyone might be able to read it from top to bottom and completely internalize it and be able to master every piece of it. So the FAQ is supposed to be more direct, more useful, to answer basic questions. So one major request to the community is to take a look at the FAQ and let us know if there are other questions that would really help adding to it. And we have FAQs for both the authors as well as the reviewers and editors. So I think that's a request to the community. And second is, in the editorial too, we bring up this notion that for this initiative to truly succeed, the entire community will have to shape it, not just quote unquote follow, but actively shape it. Right. So this is something that MISQ started. But then the direction it goes in depends a lot on every person here in this forum. And in both, we at the end, we say this initiative, can go in two directions for our community. It can become very costly and policing oriented, structure, or it can create an entirely new culture within our community where people celebrate openness and take this in a direction that is much more enjoyable, where we end up building on each other's work, celebrate imperfections, because there will be issues, there will be errors, and that's absolutely par for the course. And so as a community, how can we shape this so that it becomes a very positive experience and that we lead this effort? So I think these are two, one very nitty-gritty on the FAQ, one little more big picture request to this community to help and contribute.
Thank you, Balaji. So we now move on to our next portion where we will open up for Q&A. And once again, for the audience, please type your questions in the tab Q&A. In the next 30 seconds or so, any of the panelists, Waifong, Andrew, Avi, or Balaji, would you like to say anything?
I didn't have anything else. It was just really to reinforce that last point that Balaji made. I think it's in all of our hands. You can rest assured that we will do our very best, and we're going to work on this very hard and ensure that it's a success. But it does depend on you, and one discussion that we have had as a group is that we're very confident actually in the bright minds in our fields and the intellect and energy in our fields. We think that we can do this very well, and that authors will perhaps sometimes surprise us with what they can do. And I have given talks about this at many schools, and actually a lot of the most energy and innovative ideas are coming from doctoral students talking about this and how they can do it. So yeah, I'm really enthusiastic.
Thank you, Andrew. Question and answers. I'm looking at the tab and I do not see any questions yet, so perhaps you guys are typing.
No, the editorial was very, very well written. So.
And very detailed.
I think maybe one point to stress in terms of the mechanism, for those who didn't read the editorial, is the role of the transparency editor. Because we are actually introducing a transparency editor to actually, at the point when the transparency materials are being submitted, to help to look over the transparency materials. So it's not to review them, but it's to basically make sure that the transparency materials are in order, in accordance to at least what was specified in the paper. So I think that would be an important thing to take note of in terms of the substantial change of the editorial process.
Thank you, Wai-Fong. So your turn, audience, for any questions for the panelists. I do not see any questions, but in the meantime, while they are typing, let me ask you, what are some of the best practices that you are aware of across other disciplines in terms of research transparency, and where do we stand as a discipline in the priority list, if you will?
Maybe I could mention a couple of things and then let my colleagues jump in. As a group, we have very diverse skills and experiences, so none of us know everything. I had come to this with a knowledge that in some ways we were behind actually where we should be, and that as a field, I think we should take a leadership position. So that was kind of where I started. In terms of fields that are doing this a lot more than us, so for instance, psychology, economics, the health sciences are all sort of further ahead. There was a wonderful work on this in political science as well, for any of you who are interested. But I think what's really interesting in our field is the fact that we have approaches that are not widely used in other fields, or the approaches, I guess there's greater respect for multiple approaches and blurring of boundaries in our field compared to some other fields. And that's where I think we have a real ability to lead the discussion. That goes to something that Ivor had mentioned earlier. And maybe I'll stop there, but that was what I think is really quite exciting for us.
Thank you, Andrew. So we have our questions now. Apparently some of you were typing questions, but there was a delay in getting those to me. Monadeepa Tarafdar has asked a question. Do you expect this to have effects on the review turnaround time? Anyone of you?
Maybe I could take a start at that if you like. It should speed things up, to be honest, because we don't need masses of material early on in the process. We can defer some things until later. So one of the problems in the last 10 years is that the review packets have been growing in size, and you get these like 120-page packets and things with all of these extra tests and everything. Some of that we believe is motivated by putting in material that really can be deferred to transparency materials later on. And so it can actually speed up things for the authors and also speed up things for the editors and reviewers.
Thank you.
And if I can jump in yet, from a qualitative perspective, so the interpretive studies that I'm speaking for, I don't think that this will change the review process in any sense. It might change the way certain materials get focused on, but I don't think that that'll actually affect to any significant extent the review process and the turnaround times.
Thank you, Ivor. I'm going to announce the name of the person asking the question. If you would rather remain anonymous, just let me know. Stacy Perrer is asking the question. Some disciplines are encouraging authors to pre-register studies and share data using tools such as OSF.io, which is Open Science Framework. Are there any thoughts about this tool/framework? Any other recommendations? Let me ask Balaji and then maybe go to Andrew.
Thank you. No, so I think in the editorial, we list several examples of frameworks that are out there. And, we don't see, we don't want to be in the position to creating these ourselves. I think that will be a big cost to MISQ. And frankly, I don't think there is the resources to do that right now. The great news is that there are, amazing open frameworks that are being created just for this purpose. And so initially, I think what we envision is that researchers will find these. We have links in the editorial to a few. And then as we go about this process, there'll be learning and we'll find out the, quote unquote, best places for different genres of work. And then most likely there'll be some kind of convergence towards a few. But these would be amazing, Stacey.
Andrew, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just couldn't agree more. Yeah, so we mentioned the OSF as one of them, and some authors actually are already sending registered work to us, and it would work very well with this framework. Yeah, very well.
Next question. Is there only one transparency editor? And if so, is that person trained in the variety of methodologies that are employed in AIS research? These are the genres that you talked about. Let me ask Avior to begin.
Sure, thanks. So again, this is a learning process, so we will eventually, we might change as we go, but currently what we're thinking is that the members of the editorial are already SCs and AEs will form the subgroup of transparency editors. So there aren't any new people right now that we're thinking to appoint to this. And therefore, I guess Andrew will, and working with the SE of that paper possibly, will come up with the most suitable transparency editor from the list of various AEs and SEs already on the board. And we may find that we need more training across us to make sure that we are doing across papers. We're very cognizant that we don't want a difference in level of demand across the transparency editors, but we will source people who already have training right now in the various method of the paper. So that's less of an issue.
Thank you, Avior. Next question is, and I'll go to Waifong for this, and then others can join in. How would you address the culture that we have in our review process, that each study needs to be perfect and each paper needs to be perfect? How would you change that culture that we have?
Okay, this is a tough question. I think coming from the transparency perspective, the whole reason why we're doing this initiative is to highlight that, we probably cannot be perfect, but we got to be transparent in what we're doing. So having transparency materials out there, as Ivor was saying, it increases the credibility. As Balaji is saying, it actually helps to have more people sort of take a look at what we might not be seeing in the papers. And also it helps other people to learn from the process at which the study has gone through and created. So I think the whole idea of doing this transparency materials is to show that sometimes just depending on each of the individual authors, we might not be able to do everything. And therefore, depending on everybody's sort of eyeballs and taking a look at what we have in that transparency materials, we're trying to be open with the journey that the authors actually took. And sometimes maybe there are certain little things that the authors overlook, or sometimes we might see that there's a different perspective of looking at the same sort of materials. And with this transparency initiative, we're hoping that people will also embrace that same concept or mindset that it's a journey that all the authors are going through.
Thank you, Wai Fong. The next question asks, I would like to understand what counts as transparency material for qualitative research, which have huge data sets. So, Avia, maybe you can begin.
Yeah, sure. You know, again, I wanted to emphasize that we're not necessarily assuming that transparency in the qualitative paradigm, particularly the interpretive qualitative, is about making data available, because, of course, the ontology is that we are always interpreting, and different people might interpret the same data differently. And so the point is not the data, but rather how did we get to our interpretation? And so that might include access to data if that seems relevant and reasonable. However, an over barrage of hundreds of transcripts doesn't actually make things easier to follow or more trustworthy. It just means a lot of words that are out there. And so that is what I was referring to earlier, as each paper really needs to come to its own understanding. Transparency editor, the authors, and the SE as to what would make this piece of research easier for people to trust, to accept, to find credible, plausible, and be transparent in how it produced findings X, Y, and Z. And whether or not that is access to actual transcripts, that would be an open question. And obviously in certain contexts, it's not even a starter, because the ethics would not allow for data to simply be put in a repository, but there might be other things that can be. So whether or not it's a huge data set, it really depends on how big that data set is and what kind of data that might hold.
Thank you, Avia. Next question, perhaps, Andrew, you can begin with answering that question. Given the transparency could be a fuzzy idea, what happens if the transparency editor finds a manuscript is, quote unquote, to some extent transparent, but not enough?
So the role of the transparency editor, as described in the editorial and as how we'll implement it, is to determine if the authors have provided the material that they said that they were going to provide. And of course, that can be updated over time if the paper is changing during the review process, you know, what they're doing in consultation with their senior editor. But there's basically already an agreement between the author and the senior editor as to what the author's providing for transparency. So the transparency editor is really just seeing that that is there. They're not making their own independent judgment of, oh, you should also include this other thing. The second thing that the transparency editor is doing is seeing that it's well organized. And I know that seems like it's completely obvious that, well, everything should be well organized, but in many fields, they've actually worked very hard on things, even simple things like tables of results, making sure it's actually really crisp and clear, and anyone looking at the table can understand exactly what, you know, fields like finance, accounting, they've worked at that for decades. Again, our material, when we provide it for transparency, should be really easy to read, easy to understand. You should be able to understand what I'm going to do with this material. And again, the transparency editor can look at that. So essentially, we see the transparency editor as just making an assessment of whether authors have provided what they're going to do, and whether that material is provided in a way that other people can use. That's all they're making a decision on. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. That last question came from Hamid Nikar. The next question perhaps should be directed to Balaji, given that you are Director of Analytics. Balaji, this question was asking, all of these business schools are starting MS and business analytics programs, and faculty members come from very diverse backgrounds, including CS, OR, industrial engineering, and optimization. I suppose the question implied there is, how do we expect a standard of transparency given different disciplines that people come from?
That's a great question. You know, obviously there will be some learning if someone comes from a completely different discipline into MIS. Now, in many cases, you know, some of them publish in their own reference disciplines too, that may have their own requirements for transparency. right? So what we have here is specifically just for MISQ, right? So I don't think there's any expectation that this has to be done for every paper they write for any journal. Like, obviously our boundaries are MIS quarterly. And so there will be a learning process in terms of trying to see what the AIS reviewers and would like to see. And so it starts early. In the cover letter, for instance, they would indicate to the SC the kinds of materials they would be providing. And if there's a big disconnect there, I think the SC can point out very early on that this is either not needed, or this is too much. And so I think the SCs will be helpful if someone is coming from a different background to guide them early on. But hopefully very soon there will be some good examples too. Like, one of the nice things about our field is that once we open something like this, there will be people who would go out there with excellent initial examples. And once we have a few of these out there, it becomes progressively easier. So the first year may be a little more challenging, maybe since we are rolling it out. But if you think 12 months from now, it will take a while for these papers to make it. But when we start seeing some of these things come out, subsequent iterations, I think, will be a lot easier.
Thank you, Balaji. There is a second part of that question, I believe, I was asked. It is tangentially related to our topic today, is that given that we have so much data science going on in our discipline, do you have any plans for a few more slots for data science papers in MIS quarterly? Andrew?
I must say I was surprised. We have a lot of data science papers actually submitted to the quarterly, and Balaji, as a senior editor, can attest to the fact that he handles quite a large number of papers. And we have had multiple special issues on data science related topics. So in fact, I'd encourage you to read some of our excellent data science related papers, and I'd encourage you to submit them to the quarterly.
And I don't mind putting a shameless plug for another workshop we are thinking of doing. We have a machine learning workshop for authors for MISQ that is coming up, where we'll talk about some pointers.
Exactly. Well said.
Thank you. Related question now from Cindy Ryman Schneider. Are current training sessions underway for SE and AE board members to understand the transparency editorial role? How will consistency of transparency be ensured across all paper submissions? So Andrew, let's start with you.
Excellent question, Cindy. So yes, we've already begun that. So we've had full board meetings already to talk about this. It'll continue to be a major discussion point in the board meetings from now on. And we are all well aware of the importance of achieving a shared mindset while respecting plurality. And I can guarantee you in all of my editorial board appointments, so far already, it's been a topic in every single one-on-one meeting of a board appointee. So we're all coming to the same page. Another important element of this is that the role of the transparency editors is not only to handle the paper, but also to give guidance to the editor-in-chief. So we'll be having regular meetings where they will say, okay, this is what we've been learning, and this is then how we should, improve things. And then the final guarantee is that the MISQ Policy Committee has also said that they want to have an independent eye on this. And so, on a periodic basis, they will also be reviewing the performance of this and ensuring that it's a success. So there's multiple approaches we're taking to ensure that it's not just shop for your SE and see who lets you do what you want to do. Yeah, we're doing this as seriously as we can and ensuring it's going to be as successful as possible.
And
So
if I may just add to what Andrew is saying, I think each of the transparency editors, especially in the respective genres, will also be taking counsel to what's happening in terms of the transparency initiatives and developments in the respective genres. So, for example, in design science and quantitative research, in qualitative research, there are also developments that are happening, not just in AIS, but in adjacent fields that we will also be paying attention to and we will be taking counsel to.
Yeah. Raju, can I briefly add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Balaji.
Yeah, I saw a question from Monica earlier that scrolled up on design science, particularly transparency. What would transparency in design process be? And I think that question applies to multiple genres too. If you broaden this to how was the research done, right? So for instance, in a design science paper, maybe somebody provides the entire artifact and code, and the whole thing is available to run and so on. But you start thinking, if one piece of it is there's a machine learning model that did this, and there's a human expert whose input was provided, and they were combined to do X. I'm just picking a very small example. And then you start wondering, why did the human expert in the machine learning model, why did the designers pick it that way, right? The human expert could have contributed in so many different ways. They decided one specific way, right? Now it's fully transparent how it is, but the question was, why was it done that way? And that's, talks to the transparency of the process behind what was produced. And I think all research traditions will have it. It's up to the authors, and I think it's up to the community. It would be wonderful for the authors to look at this as holistically as possible. And it'll be wonderful for them to say, if I had a paper like mine that I read somewhere, what would I like to see, right? And then start thinking, maybe I should provide that in my own transparency material. And if done well, one of the major pluses of this is that other young researchers will start learning from this. Today we want to also celebrate global diversity and so on, and we want to bring up regions of the world where we have brilliant minds but not enough resources for learning. Imagine if they had access to papers with wonderful transparency materials, where they could read the transparency materials and figure out how research was done, right? And the amount of the positive effects of that, I think, would be tremendous for us as a community.
Thank you, Balaji. That was going to be my next question that I would read. Thank you, Monica, for asking that question. We are almost out of time for this segment of our conversation. If I missed somebody's questions, please forgive me, because depending on the number of votes, the questions move up and down, and I can lose track of that. So let me pause here and ask in just a couple of minutes, Brooke, to move us to the tables. But before we do that, I want to thank you all for joining us. Please keep in mind that this is a community effort. And the purpose of the AIS Exchange today was to listen to what you have to say, to address your concerns, to incorporate some of the suggestions that you've made and you will continue to make when we go back on the tables. So thank you again for joining us, and let's move to the tables now.